Welcome to this episode of Shaping the Future, from Pandemic to Climate Change. In this episode, I am speaking with Cambridge University's Dr. Hugh, who is also working as part of the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge, looking at ways to repair the climate. Hugh makes the point that the risks of geoengineering are less than the impacts from climate tipping points that we are facing if we don't do it. He also gives us an overview of the Centre for Climate Repair set up by former UK Chief Government Scientist Sir David King, and discusses why funding on a scale to meet the enormity of the climate crisis means unconventional sources may be necessary. The paper that this interview is based on, co-authored by Hugh and Dan Bodansky, can be downloaded freely in the notes. Thanks for listening to the podcast. It's available to subscribe on all major channels and can be viewed on YouTube. Hugh, thank you for speaking to me today. Can you first identify why you single out the Arctic for special experimentation in what we might call a geoengineering intervention?
Well, the Arctic is a pretty special place. It's responsible for maintaining steady temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere in particular. And over the last few years, we've found that there have been temperature extremes, there have been flooding, there's been climatic extremes in the Northern Hemisphere. Now, we know that the planet is warming up, but the Arctic is warming up about 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. And that's why it's special, really. It's very important for our weather, and it's responding to global warming much faster than the rest of the planet.
So in that light, are you saying that the Arctic sits outside of, say, the commitments of the Paris Agreement in limiting global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees on the average?
Well, that's a good point, that if we're saying that we should limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees, well, that is a global average. But what do we do if the Arctic warms up by 6 degrees? The Arctic warming by 6 degrees means that we probably lose all the summer ice that's floating on the Arctic Sea, which means that the albedo, or the reflectivity of that region, vanishes, so that the sun is even more effective at warming the region. The water warms up, Greenland ice shelf becomes unstable. There's getting on 6 or 7 meters of sea level rise locked up in the Greenland ice shelf. So the Paris Agreement doesn't really take that into account. It doesn't take these tipping points into account.
So you'd say that is the main argument for climate interventions in the Arctic, which traditionally have been, unpopular as a subject. Is that the main justification for a geoengineering intervention, is that really the Arctic does sit outside of our Paris commitments in that respect?
The Arctic is special. It does sit outside our Paris commitments. And the Arctic is not quite the same as other places. Yes, there are some people that live there. Yes, there is some agriculture, perhaps in Iceland and bits of Greenland and bits of Siberia. But by and large, the Arctic is a very important place for the way that our weather responds and the way that our climate responds, that we ought to think of it differently.
There's been talk about refreezing the Arctic for many years. And let's give an example of one of the solutions proposed in the paper is spraying seawater on top of the ice during the Arctic winter. Given that the Arctic Ocean is 14 million square kilometers in area and it's single year ice now and very brittle in places, how feasible are these approaches at this kind of scale? Can you talk a bit about how an intervention like that would be attempted?
The paper mentions these various schemes, possible schemes for refreezing the Arctic or for increasing the amount of Arctic ice. But it doesn't go through to say whether they're feasible or not. It's a little bit like thinking of how things were in 1942 and how we were going to win the Second World War. And there were lots of fantastic ideas. Some of them were crazy and were tried out, like bouncing bombs, let's say. There was this crazy idea to send hundreds of thousands of troops across the English Channel to land on the Normandy beaches. And that was an absolutely crazy idea. And sometimes these crazy ideas turn out to work, and sometimes they don't. We've got to do the sums. We've got to do the research. We've got to figure out which of these crazy ideas will work. I'm left thinking of Apollo 13, when there was an explosion a day or so into the mission. And of course, the sensible thing to do would be to to turn around and come back. But it turns out if you do the sums, you can't do that. So they did the most ridiculous thing. They went all the way to the moon, went around the moon and came back. But they didn't have enough resources. They didn't have enough electricity. They couldn't deal with carbon dioxide in the command module. I mean, these astronauts ought to have died, but they didn't, because really ridiculous ideas turned out to be necessary, and they worked. We don't know how ridiculous an idea is until we do the research.
So this is really a call for funding outside of the box, if we're going to be politer than calling them ridiculous, but if we say outside of the box ideas. The paper stresses that interventions are closer in kind to conventional adaptation and mitigation than they are to proposals of stratospheric aerosol injection, for example. Can you explain why?
The idea of doing global geoengineering is problematic in the sense that if I were to spray stratospheric aerosols somewhere mid-latitude, somewhere in the US or in Europe or in Russia or in China, it's going to affect the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. It means that if there's one party, let's say Europe, that's very keen on having stratospheric aerosols there to cool Europe down, well, it's going to do something to the United States, it's going to do something to Russia, it's going to do something to China, it's going to do something to India. It may switch off the Indian monsoon. You know, these things are pretty hard to predict and they're pretty dramatic. But if you were to do something just in the Arctic, it's unlikely to have an impact outside of the Arctic. It's unlikely to switch off the Indian monsoon. But the consequences of losing the Arctic are so great that we ought to be looking at the potential for some kind of Arctic geoengineering.
If the Arctic plays an integral role in the global climate system, then surely if you intervene to restore the ice, that has to have some effect on the global climate system. Are you saying that that's a positive effect as opposed to something that we didn't want, such as switching off the Indian monsoon?
What we're seeing at the moment as the Arctic region warms up is very much increased instability in our weather patterns. So we're finding that it's freezing cold in Houston and it's boiling hot in Siberia. We're finding that the weather patterns are driving wildfires in California, and that we're getting floods and heavy rains in Britain and in Europe. Things are not normal on account of the warm Arctic. And the risk of maintaining Arctic ice is small, I think. The risk of losing Arctic ice is enormous. So trying to maintain the ice and to restore the ice in the Arctic has, in my view, got to be a benefit. And of course, it will change the way the weather responds, just as it is changing already in a rather negative way.
You mentioned when you undertake global geoengineering, and you've actually been involved in a global geoengineering experiment, so you understand the complexity around it. You run the risk of crossing boundaries and unintended consequences and all that kind of stuff, which involves law, legal suits and all of that. A lot of your paper, in fact, is co-written with a lawyer. It's obviously something that you are taking very seriously in this paper, is the legal implications of even regional geoengineering. If it's less of a risk than global, why was the paper co-authored with from a legal perspective and not from more of an engineering perspective? Or is this a stepping stone to talking more about the engineering? Can you talk a bit about that?
It's quite hard to write papers about geoengineering from an engineering perspective because we've done so little work on it. There's so little work done on the implementation of geoengineering techniques. So for instance, for stratospheric aerosols, there's been a lot of modeling, computer modeling, climate modeling. There's been laboratory experiments on the effect of aerosol particles on ozone, and there's been lots of work on governance and on legality and on public perception. But there's been nothing really done at all on how would you go about delivering 10 million tons of aerosol particles to a height of 20 kilometers. Now that's the engineering challenge. And until we start actually doing experiments on this engineering challenge, there's really nothing to write about. I mean, we wrote various papers nearly 10 years ago now on and around the SPICE project. SPICE was stratospheric particle injection for climate engineering. And well, I mean, you do the sums and you check out the feasibility of using aircraft for delivering these aerosols, or perhaps using missiles, air guns, In fact, just recently we've written a paper, Doug McMartin and Andrew Lockley and myself, on just this topic. But still, it's all speculation. It's almost like writing some kind of science fiction novel. And that's not what academic papers are all about. So the legality, the legal side, the idea of getting a consensus, an agreement to intervene in the Arctic is kind of better understood, because matters of law are always matters for discussion, not matters really for actual research, going out and doing experiments. So there's a difference in the type of paper you'd write if you're thinking about matters of law rather than if you're thinking of matters of engineering.
This paper does present the argument that the geoengineering proposed is more benign in terms of this is not global scale solar radiation management. This is targeted, more in line with adaptation and mitigation. Are you saying there's no foreseen risk in these proposals?
There is a lot of risk involved in any type of geoengineering because we don't yet know what the impacts of these interventions will be. We've never done it before. But what we know is the risk of doing nothing is huge. We're heading for a perhaps 3 or 4 degree global average temperature rise perhaps by 2050 if we don't do anything. And the Arctic amplification suggests that the Arctic might warm up by perhaps 2 or 3 times that. Losing the Arctic ice, losing the ice in the Greenland ice shelf would be catastrophic. Interventions then now of the geoengineering kind in the Arctic, yes, that carries risk. But surely if you're going to be intervening with some risk in something where the risks are greater if you don't intervene, then, well, let's research that intervention. The analogy is not a great one, but the analogy with chemotherapy comes in. If you don't have chemotherapy, then you're going to die. If you do have chemotherapy, your hair's going to fall out and your organs are going to fail. And actually, you might still die, but there's a good chance that you will live quite a few years longer and you get to see your grandchildren. So what are you going to do? You're going to have the chemotherapy, even if your hair falls out.
Given that you're saying the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of intervening, how is this paper being presented to, let's say, the Arctic Council, people who are in a position of overseeing the region? Are you approaching them with this? Are you saying, look, we need a program here?
I don't think I agree that the risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of intervening, but I think it's quite likely to be the case. And the research needs to be done so that we can determine whether the intervention is worth the risk. So as for approaching bodies like the Arctic Council or the UN or whoever it might be, it's quite hard to do that. You don't kind of pick up the phone and say, look, do you mind if I talk to you about my plans for refreezing the Arctic? It really is about publishing papers like this that gets a discussion going, and hopefully a consensus builds up that the Arctic is a special place and the risks of doing nothing in the Arctic are enormous. So that the Arctic Council, of its own accord, which of course has the best interests of the Arctic in mind, will commission the appropriate research, or will at least support the appropriate research. It's unlikely that the Arctic Council would go ahead and implement some kind of risky geoengineering endeavour without proper research being done. We are, of course, running out of time with the Arctic. It is quite likely that the Arctic will be summer ice-free, well, perhaps even this year. I mean, the trend is pretty bad right now. But it's likely that the Arctic will be summer ice-free sometime in the next few years. And if it's not summer ice-free in the next few years, then that's a bonus, and we should be thankful for that. But if the Arctic does become summer ice-free in the next few years, then we've probably lost the battle. It's a bit like when a species goes extinct, not much you can do to get it back. So it's really important that we keep the ice floating in the Arctic.
You're working with Sir David King with the Cambridge Centre for Climate Repair, and Sir David has highlighted the Arctic as one of the key areas. Is this forming the openings part of that discussion as a group for the organisation?
The Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge, which has been set up by Sir David King, and I'm involved, as is Sean Fitzgerald and Ellie Standen and a few others, and a long list of collaborators and partners. The Centre of Climate Repair has 3 main objectives. The first is to press for deep and rapid emissions reductions. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. So reducing our CO2 emissions is absolutely essential. Then second is that we need to get the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are presently in the atmosphere out. So we've got to do greenhouse gas removal, and we've got to do that rapidly. And perhaps the best ways to do that is to engage the forests and the oceans in that process. Oceans look particularly attractive because it's such a large area, and the oceans have really been damaged. And if we can restore the oceans, that would be great. But none of this will happen quickly enough to help the Arctic. So the third strand of the Centre for Climate Repair is looking at some form of geoengineering to refreeze the Arctic, or to prevent the Arctic and the glaciers in the Himalayas and elsewhere and the Antarctic, to prevent this ice from melting.
Okay, so on that principle, you're essentially open for discussion around ideas and proposals.
Well, the Centre for Climate Repair is a new organisation, and we are trying to set Cambridge up as a focal point, as a centre for these kinds of ideas. And yes, we're open for people to come forward with research that needs to be done and to fund this research. The research is unlikely to be cheap because we're not talking about doing experiments in the lab and sitting at computers and modeling things. We're talking about going out in a ship and trying out ideas of, do we spray seawater onto the floating ice, or do we find ways of reflecting sunlight by brightening clouds, or do we put aerosols into the stratosphere? We're talking funding required for these types of experiments in the tens of millions of pounds. And it's unlikely that we're going to get that kind of funding on a short time scale from conventional sources. So it's going to be a rather unconventional journey, I think, the next 2 or 3 years for the Centre for Climate Repair.
Okay, and of course, time is exactly what you don't have.
It's interesting when you look at the conventional funding models for university research. It's not that difficult to get funding to the tune of a few £100,000 over a period of 3 years for a few people to do some nice research in the lab or whatever it might be. If we're talking about getting outdoor research going in completely new areas, I mean, these are areas that don't really exist now. And if we need a few tens of millions straight up, well, it's unlikely we'll get that from the standard Research Council model. So we're going to need some interesting philanthropy out there to come and help us.
Isn't it the case, though, that if you went to a Research Council or any UK department, government department, they would look at refreezing the Arctic and they would see geopolitics galore and think, I think we'll leave that one for the time being.
Isn't that interesting? Because if you get money from, say, ExxonMobil to do research on refreezing the Arctic, you might be suspicious of their motives. If you got money from the Forestry Commission for research on refreezing the Arctic, you feel as if, oh, well, that's, I think we might accept that money. But it's unlikely you're going to get tens of millions of pounds out of the Forestry Commission, but you might get tens of millions of pounds out of ExxonMobil. If the government gives you tens of millions of pounds, then the government is basically saying, we think that the ethics and governance, the principles behind this work are sound, and we will back you up. We will stand behind you and support your work. But that's not what's happening, because governments are generally very cautious when it comes to things like geoengineering. They don't want to be seen to be supporting technology that might in some way be reinforcing the message that we can carry on burning fossil fuels. Hey, look, we've got this technology that will refreeze the Arctic. So, hey, don't worry about changing your lifestyles. Flying is fine because we can refreeze the Arctic. You can see what the problem is. So if then along comes somebody with a lot of money and says, oh, we'll fund your research. Well, how do we get the governance framework in place so that the public and the global governing frameworks, the UN and the Arctic Council and so on, and they give us the thumbs up and say, yeah, that's fine. We're happy for you to do those experiments. Boy, there's quite a lot of thinking to be done on exactly this. So that's why we wrote this paper, to look at the governance of Arctic geoengineering from a different point of view. because we haven't got time to just leave the Arctic to struggle on its own with man-made climate change.
Okay, well, thanks very much. It's a good place to end, and also a good place to pick up on when something does take place.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.